Good evening, friends, and shalom, and welcome to this episode of The Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times, and I appreciate anybody who is here today. This is a political podcast held exclusively on the Synagogue News. Think like a Neanderthal, as we like to say, and don't remember to always be claiming your conservative status against those who would like to belittle you for it. I want to thank anybody who may or may not be here at the moment. If you're here, please remember to like and share this video, and please consider subscribing to this channel if you have not done so, if you are interested in this political content. Get this video shared to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. While you're going to different social media platforms, please do remember to get on Gab, Parler, or Minds. Gab, Parler, or Minds are all kind of like Twitter clones, so if you're on Twitter, please do remember to use these websites so that we can actually punch big tech in the mouth by using their competition, by taking away clicks from their websites. That is the best way to ensure that we are actually taking back our freedom to speak on political, philosophical, and religious matters online. You don't want the government getting involved. You don't want to trust these companies who have already told you that they are not trustworthy. Rather, you want to create more competition in the market, thus forcing people to actually bow to your whims if they want to indeed have your, you could say dollar, so to speak, but in this particular instance, technically they are free, but you get the ad time and all that kind of stuff, right? So they kind of get dollars off of you. At any rate, excuse me, while we're going to alternative things, please do also consider going to Rumble and BitShoot and subscribing to the channel, The Synagogue, on Rumble or BitShoot. I only post this political podcast there, not my religious apologetic stuff. So if you're one who is interested in that kind of stuff, that will not be there. But just another way to ensure that we are fighting back against big tech. And by the way, the days of this channel will more than likely be numbered on YouTube, just because they don't like it when you talk about certain things. So if you do like this particular podcast, namely The Watchdog, definitely are going to want to subscribe to us on Rumble and BitShoot. We've been having lots and lots of trouble with them recently, but that trouble finally, hopefully, is going to be fixed. And I think this video should be uploaded very soon on BitShoot. Probably like, I don't know, mere 30 minutes after we're done, to be honest with you. But at any rate, we got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about for you guys today, so I want to go ahead and jump right into some of it. But of course, as always, we are going to have a pre-article conversation. And what I want to talk about first is a little bit of Kyle Rittenhouse trial. So Kyle Rittenhouse, for those of you who may not remember, which I doubt is most people, is the young boy who, at the age of 17 last year in August, shot and killed 2 people and injured a third in Kenosha, Wisconsin during the George Floyd riots. Obviously, many people, including myself, have maintained that this was acting in self-defense. Many others say that he is a murderer. So he has obviously had a very high-profile case. He is now 18. And it was made even more high-profile by the fact that not only was this divided kind of along political lines of those who support BLM being kind of against him and those who are against BLM kind of being for him, although that's not a universal truth. It also became polarizing because he also was known to be relatively conservative himself. He has ties to the Proud Boys. He is certainly one who comes from a, you would say, Trumpist kind of family, right? And it himself has Trumpist kind of ideals. And so obviously the media decided to jump down his throat on that and somehow, basically declare him guilty of murder because of the fact that he has links with the Proud Boys and has Trumpist beliefs and stuff like that, which of course is utterly absurd and ridiculous. Now, if you look Kyle Rittenhouse up, you find quite a bit of smear pieces coming from the big news agencies. Like, so for example, one day ago, the New York Times published Kyle Rittenhouse and the New Era of Political Violence. CNN posts, the 26-year-old man killed in Kenosha shooting tried to protect those around him, his girlfriend says. That was, I believe, Andrew Tuber was his name. Let's see. Some of these are just speaking on facts there, which of course means they're neither for him or against him, but they're just repeating some things. And of course, we'll read a little bit about those because I want to talk about that. But whenever we have opinion pieces, none of them seem to be for him, but they all seem to be against him. And that obviously is a incredibly annoying thing, right? Here's another one. Kyle Rittenhouse shooting survivor sues police, sheriff for enabling armed militia. I don't know if it's necessarily accurate to, I don't know, at least they didn't call him victim, right? That was obviously a good thing. And, you know, a lot of these different things, you know, that tend to just be, I don't know, less than honest in my opinion, right? Here's another one from CNN. Kenosha shooting suspect called a friend to say he killed somebody, police say, and then shot two others. And of course that is not lined up with any of the facts that I think are on the ground at this moment, but nonetheless, who cares when Certainly Not News gets to make stuff up, right? When you actually go to the courts, Kyle Rittenhouse does appear to be winning everything so far, though, of course, there is a lot to be said going forward. It has been said that his link to the Proud Boys could not actually be presented as evidence in court. Because I guess the judge just decided that it had no relevance. I'm not 100% sure why he decided that. I'm glad he did, because I don't believe it does have relevance. The Proud Boys are not a white supremacist organization, nor are they a domestic terrorist organization. That is slander that comes from people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. In fact, the leader of the Proud Boys is quite literally Afro-Cuban, meaning both Latino and black. So obviously, wouldn't make any sense for him to be a white supremacist. But nonetheless, that was obviously a big win for Kyle Rittenhouse. It was said that he could not be tried as an adult. So that was obviously a big win for Kyle Rittenhouse, And then recently, judge says that you cannot refer to the people that Kyle Rittenhouse killed in court as victims, but they may be referred to as rioters or looters. In other words, the judge thinks that it is not technically accurate or legally accurate to refer to the men Kyle Rittenhouse killed as victims, but it is technically accurate or legally accurate to refer to them as rioters or looters. What's the point? The point is, when we actually get to the facts on the ground, it appears so far that everything is going in Kyle Rittenhouse's favor. And I think if anybody has actually seen the video evidence in question, it's pretty obvious that everything would if the court systems are actually functioning as they're supposed to. The man was clearly operating, I guess I can't necessarily say man, he was 17 at the moment, but he was clearly operating in self-defense. Obviously, there was a dangerous terrorist organization, as far as I am concerned, in Black Lives Matter and Antifa, committing violent acts of riot and terror all throughout the city. That's indisputable. They caused billions in damage. They killed 30 people. Some of the evidence of their murders are actually, of course, online, and there are some absolutely detestable videos that people have seen there as a result. And all of this indicates that not only was Kyle Rittenhouse in the moment acting in self-defense, but being there with the firearm in the first place was also acting in self-defense. In other words, there was what can only be described really as a violent insurrection in this city, and any reasonable citizen would also be armed in that situation. Frankly, just for one's own defense and for the defense of one's family and neighbors. And so far, it appears that the courts actually agree. I think that that's really cool. I'm hoping that the courts will actually come to the point where they will just either outright dismiss or have him found innocent. There's obviously a lot of other cases that are pretty similar to this all across the country. And another one that's incredibly popular is the McCloskeys, right? Who were in St. Louis standing outside. They didn't kill anybody, but they were standing. In fact, they didn't even shoot anybody. But they were standing outside their home with firearms when the BLM rioters were passing through their home, trespassing in a private neighborhood that, of course, they had no right to be in. And they were also tried, obviously not for murder, but for intimidation. And I believe there was something along the lines of like threatening with a deadly weapon or brandishing a deadly weapon or something along those lines. And that likewise has been one where the prosecution has been basically running into a wall constantly. And that's something that obviously I'm very happy to hear about, right? Because these are situations where people were clearly using their Second Amendment rights justly to defend themselves, to defend their friends, to defend their family, to defend their homes against what can only be described as a violent insurrection that has thus far been able to get away with everything scot-free, simply because it is not politically expedient to prosecute them or even go after them in media. And it is nice to see that our our judicial system isn't 100% compromised at this time, and that we actually have, at least some faith that we can have in it in these particular cases. Though we are going to be talking today about some area where we probably don't have as much faith in it. As you can see from our headliner, we are once again going to be talking about the issue of Pastor Tony Spell, because once again, Pastor Tony Spell, is in some hot water. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and get my camera on, get the screen shared, and also say hello to whoever is in the live chat. So far we have Richard Neal and Cryptomaria. So thank you very much to both of you for being here. Please remember to like and share this video. And I, of course, appreciate your guys' view and viewership. Just one moment, friends. Let me go ahead and get everything set up here. All right. So, first thing we're going to talk about today is the headliner, the thing I was just talking about. And that is, sorry about this, friends, little ad there. And that is an article from The Advocate from a little over a week ago, talking about our good friend, Pastor Tony Spell. He's not quite enjoy his stand, but unfortunately, I can't say that we know each other well enough to say we're friends, right? I've only spoken with him a few times. We obviously interviewed him once on Unapologetics. But nonetheless, we are certainly very proud of his stand against these tyrannical COVID mandates and for religious freedom, especially as we are coming near to Reformation Day, when we celebrate religious freedom, as well as the death of the martyrs, as of course it is All Hallows Eve, which is obviously what happens when you don't have religious liberty. So very much approve of Pastor Tony Spell and his stand. Here he is being charged yet again by the state of Louisiana for flouting the COVID mandates. And again, flouting the COVID mandates at this particular point in time is as simple as going to church, not enforcing social distancing, meaning not actually reducing your capacity, allowing people to come and worship with you at the church in communion with other believers. And of course, also the lack of mask requirements and things of that nature, which is obviously also ridiculous. And of course, we've seen how ridiculous it could actually get with places like California, going as far as to say, and this was not an exaggeration, right? This actually did happen in California, going as far as to say, hey, you're not actually allowed to sing in your churches because that could potentially spread COVID. You're not actually allowed to say prayers audibly in your churches because that might spread COVID. Hey, you can have this riot, and this was actually New York. Hey, you can have this riot right down the street with 10,000 people doing all of the debaucherous stuff that they're going to be doing, including but not limited to twerking and having sex and doing drugs in the middle of the street. Obviously, we all saw that, right? But this little synagogue that wants to worship on Shabbat down the road, sorry, that's not going to be allowed to happen, right? This is the kind of path we actually have before us if we bow on the matter of religious liberty to the coronarchy. However, let's talk specifically about Pastor Tony Spell, because he has been one, and indeed I would say the first major one, to actually stand up and take a public stand at that against the Coronarchy and against the Branch Covidians, as others have called them, talking, of course, about the more religious aspects, because it does appear that this is almost like a religious cult. But nonetheless, new court date set for Tony Spell, the central pastor accused of flouting pandemic rules. This is from David J. Mischel, who is a staff writer here at The Advocate, which is a local Louisiana newspaper. My understanding is that is the largest newspaper in Louisiana. And this was actually published on October the 19th, 2021. But nonetheless, this is the picture, supporters of Life Tabernacle Church Pastor Tony Spell mill around after protesting outside the 19th Judicial District Courthouse, where Spell was scheduled to have a legal hearing Tuesday, October 19th, 2021. The hearing received a continuance to a future date, and that's, of course, what we're going to be talking about here today. With the Louisiana Supreme Court weighing whether to allow criminal charges to go forward against him. Need an editor here, sir. There's supposed to be a 2 there. Anyways, a central pastor who challenged state coronavirus restrictions was back in front of a Baton Rouge courtroom Tuesday while his attorney met briefly with a judge and prosecutor inside. Attorneys for the Reverend Tony Spell are trying to throw out 6 counts accusing him of violating the state's emergency pandemic restrictions. Spell held religious services inside the Life Tabernacle Church off Hooper Road during the thick of the state's most restrictive virus-related limits on public gatherings in March of 2020. That was well before vaccines became available and the virus was more understood. Now, of course, the advocate here does appear to be trying to justify what occurred here, but nonetheless, they are actually coming out and saying exactly what it is that we're saying, exactly what it is that Pastor Spell is saying. He is quite literally being charged with having church services, right? As, of course, a shepherd of his flock, he is required to have these church services, right? He is required to be the spiritual shepherd to these people, to teach them the Bible once a week on Sunday. That's his job, right? Or whatever day of the week they decide to worship. I don't really think it matters which day of the week you decide to worship. The point is, that's his job, right? And under the First Amendment of the Constitution, we have every right to do so. However, the state of Louisiana and numerous other states across the country don't actually think you do have the right to do so, so long as somebody might be able to get the sniffles. And unfortunately, that has even bled into a lot of the so-called right-wing states, like, for example, Louisiana, which, though being led by a Democrat at the moment, is thought to have been pretty socially conservative. Obviously, that's not the case. Or maybe it is the case and the conservatives are just ones who don't actually care at this point in time, right? In other words, true conservatism is dying. I tend to think that's actually the more accurate answer, but nonetheless. Moving on, since his early clashes over Governor John Bel Edwards' restrictions, Spell has become an outspoken critic of a variety of pandemic safety rules, recently showing up at a state education board meeting to oppose mask requirements. State District Judge Ebony Johnson Rose denied Spell's request in January. In late May, a 3-judge panel of the Louisiana First Circuit Court, of Appeal, denied Spell's initial challenge at this early stage in the case. Spell's appeal, which protests the restrictions on First Amendment grounds, is now before the state Supreme Court, and hopefully it will go before obviously, unless the state Supreme Court actually rules in his favor. But it would be nice to see it go before the national Supreme Court, simply because, as I have told you guys before, I'm very skeptical of the positions of Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett on a lot of different things, and the requirements to, force churches to shut down, to have mask mandates, to have vaccine mandates, right, are some of the things that I'm actually skeptical about these guys on. In particular, Barrett is the most concerning to me, because she actually in the past has ruled in favor of vaccine mandates, though they were not coronavirus related at the time. Right. Obviously, there were vaccine mandates for a more localized case. And I don't have the particulars privy at the moment. But the point just being, it is something that I think would be interesting to see. Now, of course, it would be terrible to see if it ended up going against Pastor Spell and in favor of the state of Louisiana. But nonetheless, hopefully he doesn't even have to get to that point. Hopefully it just actually ends up getting the right ruling in the Louisiana Supreme Court. That obviously would avoid a lot of the potential troubles that we could have here. His defense lawyer, Jeffrey Brink, said the High Court has had the appeal for some time. On Tuesday, Judge Johnson Rose agreed to continue proceedings to January 18th to give the Supreme Court time to rule. So January 18th appears to be when the new court date is going to be. While Wittenbrink was inside the 19th Judicial District Courthouse, Spell and many of his followers stood outside in the median on North Boulevard, where they have often shown up during hearings on these cases, or on his cases, excuse me. The courthouse requires masks, for entry. Spell and his supporters refuse to wear them. With misdemeanor charges, With misdemeanor charges, Wittenbrink said attorneys are often allowed to waive their clients' court appearances before trial, which of course is in my opinion, a gross abortion of justice, if I could be perfectly clear and frank with the language. The Constitution quite clearly states that you have the right to face your accusers. I think the idea that because they're not going to have a mask, you can actually move forward with your case without them is absolutely absurd and definitely not in line with the United States Constitution. But of course, what do any of these people know about the United States Constitution? They're currently in the process of not only violating the First Amendment's God-given right to religious liberty, but also the First Amendment's codified God-given right to assembly, right? Because that is another right that we actually have there in the First Amendment that they are not allowed to infringe upon. It's codified right there in the First Amendment. People should do have the right to peaceably assemble, right? Which, of course, all churches are an example of peaceable assembly. At least, hopefully, I would hope that your church is an example of peaceable assembly, right? The point just being that these people have no concept of the Constitution at all. They violate this man's right to religious liberty. They violate this man's right to peaceable assembly. Now they violate his right to stand before his accusers. And of course, are we surprised? No, we are not. The 6 different charges carry a maximum of 6 months in jail. So if he ended up getting the maximum charge, he would have 3 years in jail. And I believe a maximum of about $500 in fines. So that'd be about $3,000. So at maximum, Tony Spell could face 3 years in prison, $3,000 in fines for these charges. And again, as freely admitted by this anti-Spell article from The Advocate, what he is being charged with is this right here. Spell held religious services inside his... Oh, come on. Sorry, this just keeps randomly jumping all over the place for me. My apologies. Let's see. Spell held religious services inside his Life Tabernacle Church off Hooper Road during the thick of the state's most restrictive virus-related limits on public gatherings in March 2020. That is what he is being charged with. That is his crime. He held religious services inside the building that is known as a church. Okay? And that was well before vaccines became freely available and the virus was more understood. So obviously it's justified, right? Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Now, even though he was one of the first and appears to be one of the ones who is being most railroaded, there are not a lot of people who are actually showing up to defend Pastor Tony Spell and his congregation. He believes that the big portion of the reason for that is the fact that they are a Oneness Pentecostal congregation. That could absolutely be. I don't want to necessarily, claim anything for anybody. I do think it would be interesting considering the fact that a lot of conservatives are definitely willing to stand up for the religious liberties of people who don't agree with them in other instances, like Mormons, Catholics, Jews. So I don't know why they would be specifically targeting Oneness Pentecostals, but it is a little interesting, I'll be honest. Nonetheless, it is something that I think needs to be consistently understood, needs to be consistently reported on, and hopefully with the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, Pastor Tony Spell and his congregation can actually be relieved of this ridiculous tyranny, which, though it is a small tyranny now, is on the path, towards a big tyranny later, and is definitely Pastor Tony Spell being arrested and charged with having the audacity to be a pastor, which is absolutely ridiculous. The Constitution does not say you have the right to, worship freely unless there is some kind of a coronarchy established or something along those lines. Obviously, I'm being facetious, but you guys understand the point, right? There's no asterisks. It says that they are not to be infringed, all of our rights. That includes religious liberty. That includes the right to peaceably assemble. That includes the right to stand before your accusers. All of those are found in the Bill of Rights. And Tony Spell is being railroaded at this current point in time in the state of Louisiana. I believe we need to be praying for him, praying for his congregation, supporting him here in the physical, right? And of course, one of the best ways to do that is just to report on it, talk about it, make sure that it is, in the news and that people are aware that these things are happening. But nonetheless, that is what we have on that particular story. So there is some other things we definitely want to be talking about here today. Got a couple things regarding COP26, which is the climate change conference in Glasgow, Scotland, that will be taking place between October the 31st and November the 12th, which, Lord willing, we will be reporting on very in-depth during those weeks. This article is about not only Pope Francis, but leaders from other religious circles who have actually come out in support of the agenda that is going to be displayed in COP26 and calling on world leaders to fight climate change, as of course has been somewhat of a shtick for them in the World Council of Churches, in a lot of these different Jewish and Orthodox circles, in a lot of the different papal circles, and of course Catholic circles, and of course in the papal offices, namely Pope Francis's himself. This article in particular is addressing their call for action, which of course is like their 1,000th call for action, right, on the issue of climate change. But this particular call for action does happen to be a little bit more important than some of the others, simply because it is mere weeks before we actually are going to have this climate change conference. And remember, our current president of the United States, as well as our current Speaker of the House, are both Roman Catholic. And in fact, we're going to be talking today about one of those two meeting with Pope Francis recently. Another one of those two also met with Pope Francis recently, and will be, or another one of those two is what I meant. Sorry, the emphasis there was ridiculous. The point is, both of them have met with him recently, and the other one we're going to be talking about hopefully in a later episode. But the point is, right, that he and the other religious leaders here have a lot of sway, not only over our own government, but over other governments as well. And they are calling mere weeks before this event is actually going to take place, namely COP26 in Glasgow, for some sort of action on climate change. I personally think we are going to see some religiously influenced action on climate change taking place at COP26. Whatever that happens to be, I don't actually know, right? Obviously, a lot of these international treaties aren't binding, but we'll see what happens, and hopefully we'll be, reporting in depth for you guys there. But nonetheless, COP26, Pope Francis and religious leaders call for action over climate change. This is an article from Euronews.green, which is obviously not a site that is on our side, right? But as you guys know, I do like to use opposing sources with an opposing bias, right? Because if they are saying what I am saying, then it indicates that I am not straw manning them or lying about them or spreading some kind of propaganda or rhetoric, but that I'm actually telling you guys the truth. But at any rate, this is written by Josephine Jolly, and it says, Pope Francis and dozens of religious leaders have signed a joint appeal to governments to commit to ambitious targets at the upcoming UN climate conference in Glasgow. One more time, Pope Francis and dozens of religious leaders have signed a joint appeal to governments to commit to ambitious targets at the upcoming UN climate conference in Glasgow. So they want them to actually be committing to something that is obviously bigger than what we saw, at the Kyoto Accords, at Agenda 21, or most recently at the Paris Climate Conference that former President Donald Trump, had left. The religious leaders also promised to do their own part to lead their faithful towards more sustainable behavior, as, quote, care for the environment is a moral imperative, to preserve God's creation for future generations. We have inherited a garden. We must not leave a desert to our children, end quote, said the appeal, which was signed at a formal ceremony in the Apostolic Palace before being handed over to the COP26 president, Alok Sharma. The, quote, faith and science towards COP26, end quote, meeting brought together Christian leaders, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch, as well as representatives from Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and Jainism. Hey, friends, those of you who have been watching this for a while, what is it that I have been consistently talking about literally since the beginning of this channel? I'm sure you can all say it with me. Pope Francis's planned UN of religions. For those of you who are not aware, in September of 2014, former president of Israel, Shimon Peres, visited the current pontiff, whose name, of course, is Francis, or whose regnal title, at least, is Francis, and pitched to him the idea that there should be a United Nations-style international body, but for religious groups, and that Pope Francis himself should actually head this group as sort of the general secretary or something along those lines, such as the current General Secretary of the UN, Antonio Guterres, who is a Catholic, by the way, fun fact, and a Jesuit, and a socialist. But at any rate, now that's not a conspiracy theory, by the way, just so you guys are aware. That's very well known in mainstream news. You can go find that on Vatican News. You can find that on the Jerusalem Post. You can find that on Fox News. It's September 2014, and we have documented it numerous times here on this Watchdog program. Of course, there are numerous other things we have documented here on this Watchdog program. Some of them, unfortunately, are not here because they were on the Facebook channel, and all the videos on that channel did end up getting deleted. But where we talked about how in 2018, on the 70th year anniversary of the World Council of Churches, Pope Francis actually had communion with the World Council of Churches, right? Or we talked about how in 2019, Pope Francis dedicated a Mormon temple in Rome. Or we've talked about how also in 2019, September, Pope Francis held the Amazonian Synod, where it was declared by the Catholic Church that all rites, meaning R-I-T-E-S, or religious rituals, that are supposed to be towards a divine being, are indeed worship of the self-same God, right? Or where he took also the Pachamama statue and declared it Our Lady of the Amazon, and it now sits just mere feet from St. Peter's Basilica to this day, which, of course, is only 2 years later. And, of course, earlier this year, we talked about the international prayer at where Pope Francis led a prayer with numerous other members of the, quote, Abrahamic faiths, meaning those who have at least a traditional lineage stemming from really Moses, but they say Abraham. Excuse me. Nonetheless, we talked about that quite frequently. Some of you guys may remember those episodes. If you don't, definitely check them out. They are still here on YouTube, and I got a full playlist full of all the Watchdogs, including those that were on the Synagogue channel before we split the two up, if you guys are interested in checking those things out. So, we have this idea that was put forward in September of 2014 of a UN of religions, and then we have all these things that Pope Francis keeps doing, right, such as the Amazonian Synod to try and link himself with pagans, and signing agreements with Muslims, and dedicating temples to link himself with Mormons, right, and so on and so forth, having communion with the World Council of Churches, and now he's having Abrahamic prayers at a pagan temple called the Ziggurat in and then we have here in this actual case here where he's with other members of like Zoroastrianism and Jainism and all this other kind of stuff, having international appeals and stuff like that. And it looks very much to me like this thing that Pope Francis and Shimon Peres talked about in 2014, which we here at the Watchdog have been harping on constantly in almost every single episode, is actually coming to fruition before our very eyes. And as I have told you guys before, I firmly believe that we will live to see the United Nations of Religions set up. I don't know what they're actually going to call it, right? I only know it as the United Nations of Religions because that's exactly what Shimon Peres pitched it as, right? So I continue to say that so that if you guys look that up, you'll actually get the right articles, right? Because that is exactly what Shimon Peres called it. But you have seen since then that has been basically the lens through which Pope Francis has done everything. It explains all of his ecumenism. It explains all of his, turning a blind eye to things like the Catholic Church and the Chinese Communist Party and the Saudi Arabian monarchy, and his incessant need to be involved in all of these different peace negotiations, such as North Korea, South Korea, and China, Taiwan, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Greece, Turkey, and Turkey, Israel, and Palestine, Israel, and so on and so forth, right? He is establishing what appears to be, at least to me, this UN of religions, which he frankly has said he wanted to establish to begin with, right? Again, this is not like this is some kind of conspiracy theory. In fact, this is something that very many people, both on the progressive and so-called conservative sides, agree with. They think it's a good idea, right? And here you see a, example of how we are moving towards exactly that. The Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch, the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch, who is considered the first among elders in the Eastern Orthodox churches. I don't know if that actually applies to the Oriental Orthodox churches like Ethiopian Tawahedo or the Assyrian churches, but it might. I'm not 100% sure. But nonetheless, at least the Eastern Orthodox churches. So that'd be like the Patriarch in Jerusalem, your Russian Orthodox. I believe I guess I'm not sure all of the different dioceses that are actually Eastern Orthodox. Somebody can probably remind me of what all those are. But nonetheless, right, Eastern Orthodox there. Obviously, you had the Archbishop, of Canterbury, who is supposed to be a representation of the Anglican Church. You have representatives from Islam, from Jainism, from Zoroastrianism, from Judaism. Seems like all of the major religions were here. And they decided to make an appeal right before the climate conference where all of the political parties are going to be meeting with each other. You see the problem, right? I would not be surprised, ladies and gentlemen, if this UN of religions is starting to be called by its official name before the end of this year. I would not be surprised if legislation to bring it into creation was actually being drafted by next year. I would not be surprised if this was something that was set up and functioning by, some might say 2030. I almost wonder if by our next election, 2024. Maybe that's a little bit too quickly. But it does seem to me like the wheels are turning pretty quickly. Nonetheless, experts say the appeal is a make or break chance to curb greenhouse gas emissions. Quote, allow me to offer 3 concepts for reflection on this shared endeavor. Openness to interdependence and sharing, the driving force of love, and the call to respect, end quote, declared Pope Francis. Excuse me. Meeting follows a youth climate summit in Milan last week. The meeting follows a youth climate summit in Milan last week. And many of the faith leaders are now insisting that faith and science must listen to each other to save the planet. Quote, we need our youth to continue their call to change with the passion that we have heard today. We need the scientists with their academic authority to amplify further their voices in the public debate. And we need faith leaders to use their moral leadership to make the case for action, end quote, said Sharma. Now, obviously, you can see that appeal to authority in the academic fields, right, which is something that we have certainly seen pushed forward a lot, not just, incredibly so recently, but also, in the past, people talking about how, you can't actually be, relevant in any of these different fields unless you have such and such a PhD, right? And obviously, there are certain fields where perhaps somebody should have some qualifications. There are other fields, for example, philosophy, where the mere act of doing something actually makes you somebody who is, a practitioner of that art, right? You don't need a degree in art to be an artist. You just need to do art. Likewise, you don't need to have a degree in history to be a historian. You just need to do history, right? But nonetheless, it has obviously gotten now to the point where you're not even allowed to make decisions for yourself, health-wise. You have to listen to your health experts in order to do that. And by the way, only the health experts that they like, because plenty of PhD health experts are against them. But, who cares what those people have to say? In their appeal, the church leaders begged political leaders to adopt measures to limit temperature rises and for countries that are most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions to provide financial support to the most vulnerable communities. Now, of course, they don't necessarily mean groups like China or India or anything like that. What they're talking about is the European Union and the United States, because they would like the West to be weak, and they would like these nations that they have already signed alliance with to be strong. But that's just your J theory coming in, right? Pope Francis is widely expected to attend the COP26 on October the 31st, a summit aiming on October the 31st. I didn't actually know that. I'm doing my Reformation Day special on that. That's a Sunday. Might have to talk a little bit on the Reformation Day special about some new stuff. That's unfortunate, but nonetheless, hopefully the next Monday after that, on November the 1st, we'll have some interesting stuff to talk about. I didn't actually know he was showing up on October the 31st. I knew he was showing up, but I didn't know it was October the 31st. Man, that sucks. Maybe we'll do a late night watchdog or something. I don't know. Man, it's a Sunday too. We don't actually do watchdogs on Sundays. Anyways, let's just continue on. Can't believe I missed that. Anyways, Pope Francis is widely expected to attend the COP26 on October the 31st, a summit aiming at securing more ambitious commitment to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, with a goal of keeping it to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. The Vatican has not yet confirmed Pope Francis's presence. I do definitely hope that he maybe shows up late so that I can actually do a watchdog, maybe even live reporting. That would be nice. I wanted to talk about the Reformation, not necessarily what the Pope is actually doing on October the 31st, because it's also Reformation Day. But nonetheless, man, I'm actually really annoyed that I missed that. Would have planned ahead for that. Really quickly, I want to acknowledge some people in the live chat before we go to our next article. So, Jerome M. is here. Thank you very much for being here, brother. Calvi Cuello is also here, and thank you very much for being here as well. Jerome M. asks, do I have any shirts or swag of your Watchdog emblem? Would love to have a shirt with a large decal of it. I don't yet, brother, but I will here soon, hopefully, not only have shirts, which will be made to order and therefore probably kind of expensive, but also mugs. I want to get hoodies. I'd like to get beanies and hats as well. And I actually want to get not just the Watchdog logo, but also the Synagogue News logo, the Synagogue logo, the Unapologetics logo, and some other things that I just have for kind of various shirt ideas, right? So hopefully, you know, that'll actually be happening sooner rather than later. I have to find somebody who can do it for high quality and who can do it for at least reasonably cheap, because obviously, you know, I will be having to pay for the things, you know, make to order, because I don't have nearly enough people who would buy it right now to justify ordering some in stock, right? Obviously want to make sure we make at least some sort of a profit off of it too, so that we can continue actually to get this stuff out. So, you know, just got to find some sort of a balance there. But just to confirm, though, for you, we are actually in the process of looking for people to make shirts and hoodies and coffee mugs and stuff of that nature. So if you're excited for something like that, definitely do stay tuned. He also says, keep to the Reformation Day and do a review of the Pope visit and speech. That is probably what I will end up doing, because the next day after that, Monday, is when I'm supposed to have a watchdog anyways. So, you know, nonetheless, we'll definitely see what happens there. Now, we're going to diverge from Pope Francis for a moment, though we'll be coming back to him, and talk a little bit about the COP26 itself. This is an article from Reuters saying, Explainer, Sticking Points at the UN Climate Conference, written by Nina Chesney. And it's going to go through for us some of the different things that are to be discussed on this particular day, namely October the in this particular week, I should say, weeks. Man, I can't even get my stuff straight. October the 31st to November the 12th. Excuse me. So starting the article here, London, October the 27th. Representatives from nearly 200 countries will meet in Glasgow, Scotland from October the 31st to November 12th for climate talks to strengthen actions to tackle global warming under the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015. Against the backdrop of extreme weather events, let me go ahead and scroll down here. Against the backdrop of extreme weather events around the world and a United Nations climate report that said global warming was close to spiraling out of control, which of course is what they say every single time there's a possibility that they could potentially get more power, the actions of governments at this conference will determine whether it is a success. 6 years ago in Paris, countries agreed to cut greenhouse gas emissions to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. To do this, emissions need to be cut in half by 2030 and reach net zero by around mid-century, which of course is not only impossible and would not only drag the first world back into the dark ages, but would actually be incredibly miserable for those who are trying to get out of poverty. And here I don't actually mean people like, you know, who are stuck in ghettos in like Chicago and Detroit, or even something as bad as the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. But I'm actually talking about places like Africa and South America, where having some of these fossil fuels and things that produce too much emissions, right, can end up being vital to getting food, to getting air conditioning and heating, to getting medicine, depending on how you're actually utilizing it, right? Because obviously, there's a whole bunch of different things that we just take for granted, today that we get as a result of, whether directly or indirectly, fossil fuels and things which produce a lot of greenhouse gases, quote unquote. As the UN conference was postponed last year due to the pandemic, this year is the deadline for countries to make steeper emissions cut pledges called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. The annual emissions gap report by the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, which measures the gap between anticipated emissions and those consistent with limiting the temperature rise this century, has agreed in this Paris Accord, said updated pledges only reduce forecast 2030 emissions by an additional 7.5% compared to the previous commitments. It continued throughout this century. This would lead to warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius, slightly less than the 3 degrees Celsius UNEP forecast in its last report. A 30% cut is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and a 55% cut is needed to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is said current commitments to net zero could limit warming to around 2.2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, but 2030 pledges so far do not put major emitters on a clear path to this. So basically, they want to speed everything up. They're saying, hey, we could totally bring down emissions by the turn of the century, maybe, but we want to be bringing these down by 2030. So we got to get going, get our Green New Deals in, get our international bodies with teeth, as Secretary General Gutierrez said, or get our UNs of religions, as Pope Francis wants to pass out. I'm not saying these plans are necessarily related or anything, but, they may or may not be necessarily related. Major emitters China and India, together responsible for around 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, have not yet come forward with strengthened NDCs and need to do so at this conference known as COP26. Finance. As far back as 2009, developed countries agreed to raise $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries, deal with the impacts of climate change. But a plan on how to do so, prepared by Canada and Germany ahead of the United Nations COP26 summit in Scotland, said the annual target would now not be met until 2023. As rich nations are not meeting the $100 billion a year goal, it can break down trust at the climate talks, experts say. And a new finance goal needs to be worked out for 2025 onwards. Now, let me be the first to say that not only do I not want $100 billion of the nation's money going to any sort of international organization whatsoever, but I don't actually want a single penny of the nation's money going to fund anything that has anything to do with international governments whatsoever, right? Frankly, these governments do not help impoverished nations as they claim to do. Rather, they do nothing but empower very disgusting and evil people to do very disgusting and evil things. Go ahead and look up some of the atrocities committed by UN peacekeepers if you don't actually believe me, because they're one of the most detestable organizations in the world, and you certainly do not want to be giving them your money. They also, by the way, happen to internationally provide abortions, and the UN is actually the largest provider of abortions in the entire world. Yeah, that's right, in the entire world. Forget Planned Parenthood and what they do in America. We're talking about people who export this atrocity globally. $10 billion dedicated to it from the United States alone in the last decade. Loss and damage. Governments agreed to address the impact of climate change on developing countries, but there is no detail about liability or compensation, a bone of contention for many poorer countries. A platform to enable technical assistance for vulnerable countries was established in 2019, but developing nations want a more robust mechanism to include financing. Fossil fuels. The UK COP26 president, Alok Sharma, has said he wants this conference to be one where coal power is consigned to history. In other words, he wants to get rid of it. The UN has called for phasing out coal, yes, getting rid of it entirely by 2030 in OECD countries, but environment ministers from the group of 20 big economies have failed to agree to a timeline. And of course, the reason for this is not only would this absolutely decimate the energy industries, but it would also cause millions upon millions of people all throughout the world to be unemployed. And of course, unemployed people are dangerous people because they don't have the capability of providing for themselves or their families. They get desperate. Desperate people get violent. So obviously, this is a stupid idea. And of course, it's not just coal that they wish to get rid of. They also want to get rid of the fossil fuel industries as well, which also employ millions of people all across the world. Article 6. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which covers the role of carbon markets, has not been resolved since the pact was struck. Progress on it broke down on the last talks in 2019. The article calls for robust accounting to avoid double counting of emissions reductions. It also aims to establish a central UN mechanism to trade carbon credits from emissions reductions generated from low carbon projects. And that is the end of the different things that at least Reuters thinks will be key talking points in Glasgow. Now, of course, there is ways that we could have clean energy that they don't actually want us to utilize. For example, nuclear energy, as was being shown in the picture that we had just seen when we were scrolling up. They don't like that. They also don't like fossil fuels, even though they have the highest caloric outtake of anything that we've actually been able to find, with the exception, of course, of nuclear power. They don't like natural gas. They don't like coal. They want to get rid of all these things so that we have basically no fuel whatsoever, completely destroy our energy industry, completely destroy our grid, right? For absolutely unproven technologies that are going to cost billions, if not trillions of dollars for each individual nation, and causing millions of people all across the world to be unemployed while they do so. But of course, they don't care. They don't care so long as their agenda in the climate issue is passed, so long as they have their UN with teeth, so long as they have their United Nations of religions. Anyways. Next thing we have here, some fast facts as Biden meets with Pope Francis. Yes, Biden was meeting with Pope Francis. And of course, Nancy Pelosi has also recently met with Pope Francis. And we'll be talking about that, hopefully, Lord willing, on Friday. But nonetheless, here are some fast facts from Biden's meeting with Pope Francis. This is from the Pew Research Center. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just in case you guys are reading along. President Joe Biden is set to meet Pope Francis at the Vatican this week as part of a larger trip to Europe. Excuse me. By the way, the picture you're seeing is from 2015, right here. It's not from any time recently, just so you guys know. President Joe Biden is set to meet with Pope Francis at the Vatican this week as part of a larger trip to Europe. That they plan to discuss topics such as climate change and poverty. The meeting also takes place amid a debate whether Biden, the nation's second Catholic president, should receive Holy Communion. Biden's support of abortion rights has prompted some Catholic clergy to argue he should be denied communion, but in September, the Pope said politics has no place in questions about who gets the Eucharist. Now, of course, this is not politics. This is the murder of babies. But what else would you expect from a double-speaking snake like Pope Francis? I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be that harsh with it. The Bible does say, "Call no man fool, and to love even your enemy." But I definitely do not trust Pope Francis, and I think he's a duplicitous person. But that's just my opinion, obviously. Ahead of the meeting, here are some Pew Research Center survey findings about Biden, the Pope, the debate over whether the president should have communion, and more. Overall, 64% of U.S. adults said they think Biden is at least somewhat religious, according to a March 2021 survey. And I would say he probably is, because the thing about the Catholic Church is they're not really, I don't know, a lot of Catholics aren't particularly serious. It's almost like a cliche that Catholics aren't serious. I remember my good buddy of mine, who I won't actually name because he's not actually online or anything like that. I remember he had left the Catholic faith, unfortunately to atheism as one of the religiously abused, but nonetheless, and one of the things he would always quip is Catholicism is just feeling guilty for something, but you can do whatever you want. And he pointed to Mardi Gras, which is quite literally a Catholic holy festival, as an example of that. I've always kind of pointed out how I think it's ironic that people will give up vices for Lent for 40 days, meaning they understand these things are bad, but then for the other 325 days of the year, it's perfectly fine to do these things, which you just admitted for those 40 days was actually bad, sinful, viceful, shouldn't do it, right? And, again, there's tons of examples of the Jack Catholic, if you will, all throughout the media. It's not, like I said, almost something of a cliche. Madonna, Mia Khalifa, Cardi B, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know what I'm saying? Like, again, it's something that has, quite frankly, been a cliche for quite some time. So I'm not necessarily, so I know, again, you can look to a lot of these politicians, right? Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden. I'm not necessarily saying that they're not actually religious, because I think their religion is false and does actually lead you to these kinds of things. Though I do have a great deal of respect for traditionalist Catholics, in fact, much more than any other kinds of Catholics. And I've often made the claim that if I were a Muslim, I'd be a fundamentalist and Wahhabi. If I were a Catholic, I would be one of the traditionalists. I think that they are actually the ones who are correct. So I don't want to pretend that, there isn't a group of Catholics who doesn't take serious issue with the Jack Catholic. But the Jack Catholic and the Jack Mormon are two of the biggest Jack cliches, if you will, in all of American religious cliches. But views differed widely by partisan affiliation. Nearly 9 in 10 Democrats, and independents who lean toward the Democratic Party, 88%, said Biden is at least somewhat religious, including 45% who said he is very religious. By contrast, almost 2/3 of people who identify with or lean toward the Republican Party, 63%, said Biden is not too or not at all religious. Now, there's pretty easy explanation for that, right? First off, you are more likely to have Roman Catholic Democrats than you are to have Roman Catholic Republicans, although you are more likely to have traditionalist Roman Catholics be Republicans than to have traditionalist Roman Catholics who are Democrats. So that is the first thing. Also, progressive Christians are more likely to be Democrats than they are to be conservatives. And progressive Christians are more likely to have a laxed view of what does and does not constitute a religious person and what does and does not constitute legitimate religious belief. So it does make a lot of sense that people who are more inclined toward progressivism and also people who have a greater number of Catholics are going to be more on the side of Joe Biden, who not only is more inclined toward progressivism in both the political and religious senses, but also is himself a Roman Catholic. Whereas for the most part, with Republicans, for a lot of them, it tends to be either mainline Protestantism or evangelical Protestantism, with, of course, traditionalist Catholics also being in that group as well as a lot of conservative Mormons and groups like that. And you can see the breakdown that they actually have here if you guys are interested in that. I'll try to remember to actually set up the description so that there's links everywhere for you guys, but we're going to go ahead and keep reading. Among U.S. Catholics, 69% said in the same March survey that Biden is at least somewhat religious. But views again differed substantially by party. About 9 in 10 Catholic Democrats, or 89%, said Biden is at least somewhat religious, including 51%, who said he was very religious. Among Catholic Republicans, a 56% majority said Biden is not too or not at all religious. Notice that number does go down from the overall number because even amongst conservative Catholics, there is more of an inclination towards accepting his faith, even though it is still less than half. And again, traditionalist Catholics are definitely more likely to be Republican than Democrat. 2/3 of Catholics said in March 2021 that Biden should be allowed to receive communion during Mass, while 29% said that he should not be allowed to do this. So as you can see, it is a very small number of Catholics who do actually believe that he should not receive communion. And I don't believe Pope Francis is going to reject communion. He made very clear in September that he's not going to do that, that he thinks that he doesn't have any place in politics or anything like that, right? Which, of course, not only is it an outright lie in the sense that this is a moral issue, so if you were actually the moral leader of the church, then you would have explicit jurisdiction here. Of course, he's not, but that's neither here nor there. But also, on top of that, Pope Francis is absolutely involved in politics all the time. We literally were just reading an article where he was talking about presenting a call to climate action to the United Nations political leaders, right? So that's just an absolute joke for him to say that he doesn't think that he should get involved in politics, right? But nonetheless. However, among Catholic Republicans, a slim majority said Biden's abortion stance should disqualify him from receiving communion. Just 11% of Catholic Democrats said the same. By the way, if you guys like holiday flavors on coffee, peppermint mocha and pumpkin pie are both bomb. But definitely grab yourself some of this Nestle Toll House cocoa and cookie. It's just fantastic. But anyways, not sponsored. 6 in 10 U.S. adults had a favorable view of Pope Francis, and 28% viewed him unfavorably, according to a September 2021 survey. Now, that 60% roughly is actually less than what it used to be. Pope Francis, used to have actually pretty wide support both amongst Catholics and non-Catholics, and that has decreased over time, though it is still the majority of the United States population, at least according to this particular article. Among U.S. Catholics, views of Francis have remained fairly steady recently. Overall, 83% of Catholics had a favorable view of the Pope, while just 14% expressed an unfavorable view, according to the same September survey. And of course, he has done everything he can to try and dissuade people from joining that group by trying to remove traditionalist Catholics from positions of power, by trying to reduce the power or change the power dynamic or change the ultimate point or creeds of certain conservative organizations, or by getting rid of certain traditional customs, if you will, or rituals, such as the traditional Latin Mass, going out of his way to try and alienate these people so that they are actually considered to be not only, more and more schismatic and more fringe, but also so that other people are looking at them and saying, oh, hey, I don't actually think it's worth, joining this particular group. That was a little changed from March, 82% versus 14% respectively, though it actually went up a little bit on the, those who had a favorable view of him. The September survey found ongoing political polarization in the way Catholics view the Pope. Catholic Democrats were 20 percentage points more likely than Catholic Republicans to have a favorable view of Francis, 91% versus 71%. But as you can see, even 71% of Catholic Republicans, which is well over 2/3, have a favorable view of Pope Francis. I don't understand how, but they do. In the September 2021 survey, Catholic Republicans were less inclined than Catholic Democrats to say yes when asked whether positive words like compassionate, humble, and open-minded describe Pope Francis. The majorities of Catholics in both parties said the Pope does embody these traits. Catholic Republicans were more likely than Catholic Democrats to ascribe certain negative attributes, including out of touch and naive, to Francis. Nearly half of Catholic Republicans said the Pope is too liberal, 49%, so that is indeed less than half, while just 16% of Catholic Democrats said this. Biden and Francis plan to discuss climate change, an issue on which the Pope has been outspoken. In a 2017 survey, U.S. Catholics' views on climate change also differed by party. 8 in 10 Catholic Democrats said the earth is warming mostly because of human activity, such as burning fossil fuels, but just 22% of Catholic Republicans said the same. So that's the end of what we have there. And let me see how long I've actually been going here before we continue on. About 63 minutes. Okay. So that's what we have there that I wanted to share with you guys. Last thing here that I want to read a little bit on. U.S. gives harshest public rebuke yet on Israeli settlement plans. This is an article from Haaretz, which is actually an Israeli newspaper. I forgot that I ran out of the free articles for Haaretz. Never mind, we're not going to read this. However, to briefly give you guys an idea of what was going on, why we wanted to talk about it, the United States government has harshly rebuked the Israeli government because the Israeli government has, for the first time under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and for the first time under the new coalition government, decided to move forward with new settlement plans in the so-called West Bank, which of course is accurately referred to as Judea and Samaria. Now, this is almost assuredly, in my opinion, going to destroy this coalition because there are many liberals and many Islamists who are actually a part of this coalition. So I think that this is going to end up leading in some way to either another election because of a vote and no confidence, or at least some level of pushback that forces Naftali Bennett to reconsider what his government is going to move forward with. But nonetheless, President Biden and the United States government have harshly condemned this and are, making very clear that they are against Israel's settlements in Judea and Samaria, or what is commonly known as the West Bank. And of course, it is the position of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party that Palestine actually be established as a separate nation from Israel, encompassing all of Judea and Samaria, as well as West Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. I believe they still take the position that the Golan Heights should be given to Syria as well. But I'm not 100% sure what the Biden administration or the Democratic Party's official position would be on that. But nonetheless, since we can't actually read that, we'll go ahead and end it here. I hope you guys did like this video. I hope that you appreciated the content that we were putting out today. If you guys are a fan of this political podcast, of this political news channel, I am trying to make this the new conservative thing, right? Obviously, in competition with Daily Wire and InfoWars and Fox News and all these others who are on the conservative side, right? So if you guys think that it is deserving of that, definitely do consider subscribing to this channel and hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Lord willing, I try to go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, specifically in the mornings, but, I'm very terrible at actually getting out on a scheduled time, so I don't want you guys to put too much stock in that. Again, please remember to like and share this video. Please remember to go to BitShoot and Rumble and subscribe to the Synagogue there. We will have this video uploaded there very soon, and we'll be uploading all of our videos there as a backup. Also, please do consider, if you have not done so, I already said the subscribe. Sorry, my apologies. If you guys actually think that this is deserving of being a full-time job for me, as of course I want to do not only this, but also the apologetics and all the other different academic things that we are doing, which, praise the Lord, I live in a country where my dream of being polymathic for his glory is actually attainable. But nonetheless, if you would like to help contribute to that, please do consider giving to the Patreon here. Certainly do appreciate you guys doing that. I don't know. Currently, I only have one Patreon, but I may actually set up a different Patreon for this so that my religious Patreon for apologetics and my Patreon for this is actually different. But nonetheless, if you guys like this, definitely do appreciate you giving there. Hopefully, we will be back on Friday with an episode Friday at 10 a.m. my time, which is Mountain Time. Of course, Lord willing, right? But nonetheless, that is the plan. And yeah, that's basically all we got. So I appreciate you guys very much. I want to remind you to be watchdogs. And in the face of Armageddon, which we very, very well may see, ask yourselves this question. Will you compromise? I say no. Shalom.